White officer spits on black man, then learns he's the new police chief. It started with a hot summer morning and a cold act of hate. Officer Grant, a white cop with a reputation for being tough on the streets, stood outside a café, barking at a man whose only crime was being there. The man, tall, dressed sharp, calm, had parked his car near the sidewalk, unaware that this officer carried more than a badge. He carried prejudice like a weapon, words turned into venom. The officer spat, literally on the man's shoes, a mark of humiliation. People stopped. Phones came out. The black man stood frozen, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. He said nothing. He simply looked at the officer, eyes filled with quiet fire, then walked away. The officer laughed, wiping his mouth with pride, never imagining that in less than 24 hours, the same man he spat on would become his new commanding officer. Karma was already on its way to report for duty. Officer Grant strutted into the precinct that morning like a man convinced the world belonged to him. His boots hit the floor with a rhythm that echoed his ego, sharp, confident, unshaken. To him, authority wasn't about justice, it was about control. He believed the badge made him untouchable, that it gave him the right to decide who deserved respect and who didn't. The coffee machine hissed in the corner while a group of officers gathered around, laughing about their shifts, the latest arrests, the troublemakers from the other side of town. Grant was the loudest among them, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He carried stories like trophies, moments where he put people in their place. That morning, he told him about the man from the café. "You should have seen his face," Grant said with a grin. Walked away like a scared little boy. Didn't even open his mouth. The room filled with uneasy chuckles. A few younger officers looked down uncomfortable, but none said a word. In that culture, silence was safer than courage. Grant mistook that silence for agreement. He always did. He leaned back in his chair, savoring the attention. "You see, that's the problem with these people," he added, tapping his badge. "They don't get respect until they learn it the hard way." The words hung in the air, heavy, ugly, and real, yet to him, they were normal. He didn't see the weight they carried because he'd lived too long in a world that told him he was right. His father had been a cop, his uncle too, both men cut from the same cloth. Hard, traditional, convinced that kindness was weakness. They taught him that fear was the fastest way to control people. And Grant had learned that lesson well. He carried it like a second skin. Every time he pulled someone over, every time he shouted an order, he felt that old teaching pulsing in his veins. He didn't notice the new recruits watching him with quiet disapproval. He didn't see how the room had grown tense. He was too busy laughing, too proud to realize that his version of tough was slowly turning into something poisonous. Behind his back, a few officers exchanged looks, not because they disagreed, but because they knew it would catch up to him eventually. Karma had a way of finding people like Grant, even if it took time. When his superior called him into the office later that morning, Grant assumed it was for praise, maybe a commendation, maybe a new assignment. He walked in with his usual swagger, bag gleaming, smirk in place, but something in the air felt different, heavier, colder. He brushed it off, sat down, and crossed his arms like a man who believed nothing could touch him. He didn't know it yet, but the walls around his arrogance were about to crack. By noon, the station buzzed like a hive of rumors. Word spread fast. A new police chief was arriving, someone from another city, a reformer with a reputation for shaking things up. The chatter grew louder with every passing minute. Some officers were excited, others skeptical, but most were simply curious. Officer Grant leaned against his desk, smirking. "Reformer," he repeated mockingly. "That's just code for someone who's never worn the uniform. Probably some political puppet here to make speeches." He tossed a crumpled paper cup into the trash and missed. Bet he's never even had to chase a suspect down an alley. The men around him chuckled, though not as freely as before. The morning's arrogance still lingered in the air, sour and thick. The captain's voice echoed through the hallway, calling everyone to assemble in the briefing room. Officers lined up in uneven rows, their uniforms stiff, their faces masks of forced respect. The mayor was there too, flanked by senior officials, smiling like a man proud of a new headline. Cameras were set up in the back. The air smelled faintly of coffee and tension. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, his tone rehearsed and hopeful. "Today marks a new chapter for our city and for this department." Grant folded his arms, rolling his eyes at every word. To him, speeches were just noise, empty promises made by people who'd never faced the streets. When the mayor continued, Grant barely listened. He whispered sarcastic comments to the officer beside him, cracking jokes under his breath. But then the room shifted. A pause, a hush so complete that it demanded attention. The doors opened. Every eye turned toward them. A man stepped in, calm, confident, dignified. His presence was commanding without trying. His stride was steady, his posture tall, his face familiar. Too familiar. Grant's smirk froze. His chest tightened, his breath caught in his throat. It was him, the man from the café. The one he had spat on that very morning. The man whose shoes still carried the stain of Grant's hatred. But now he stood at the front of the room, wearing not defiance, not anger, but composure. He wore authority like armor, and respect followed him naturally, not forced, not demanded, but earned by the weight of who he was. The mayor smiled wider. "Allow me to introduce your new chief of police," he announced proudly. The applause was hesitant at first, then stronger, filling the room with claps that seemed to echo Grant's heartbeat. The chief looked out over the sea of uniforms, his gaze calm but sharp. When his eyes met Grant's, time stopped. It wasn't anger in that look. It was something far worse, recognition, understanding, a silent acknowledgement of what had happened. Grant's throat went dry. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck. The words from his morning brag replayed in his mind, each one cutting deeper. He stood stiff, hands trembling behind his back, trying to hide the truth from his own conscience. The laughter he'd once shared with his colleagues now felt miles away, replaced by the heavy weight of humiliation pressing down on his chest. The new chief's first day was a storm wrapped in calm. His presence carried quiet authority, the kind that didn't need volume to command respect. Everyone was walking on eggshells, whispering about the café incident that had already started to spread through the department like wildfire. Grant tried to act as if nothing had happened, though his every step felt heavier than the last. When the chief's assistant appeared at his desk and said, "Chief wants to see you," a cold wave of dread swept over him. He followed her down the hall, each click of her heels echoing like a countdown. Inside the office, the air was still. The blinds were half closed, sunlight cutting through in thin golden lines. The chief stood by the window, his back turned, hands clasped behind him. "Take a seat. Officer Grant," he said without turning around. The voice was calm but carried an edge that made Grant's pulse quicken. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking under his weight, and tried to steady his breathing. The chief turned, his expression unreadable, part composed, part piercing. His eyes carried the kind of strength that came from surviving injustice without letting it poison you. "Do you remember me?" the chief asked, his tone flat, almost conversational. Grant's mouth went dry. He forced out a weak laugh. "Sir, I meet a lot of people on duty." The chief cut him off with a raised hand. "No," he said quietly. "Remember?" Silence hung between them like smoke. Grant's fingers twitched on the armrest. "It was a misunderstanding," he said finally. "Things got heated. I didn't." The chief stepped closer. "You didn't what?" "Mean to spit on me. Mean to humiliate a man who did nothing wrong." His words were sharp, but his voice never broke its calm. It was the kind of calm that made the truth harder to escape. Grant lowered his eyes. He wanted to say sorry, but the words felt useless now. The chief studied him for a long moment, then spoke again, slower this time. "I remember your face. But more than that, I remember your choice. Because who we are when we think no one important is watching, that's the real measure of a man." Grant swallowed hard. His chest burned with embarrassment, the kind that stripped away pride layer by layer. "I'm not here to destroy your career," the chief continued. "I'm here to make sure you understand something that badge alone will never teach you. Respect." The word landed heavy, not as an accusation, but as a challenge. Grant nodded faintly, eyes glassy, his throat too tight to form a response. The chief turned back toward the window, hands still clasped, his reflection fractured by the light slicing through the blinds. Grant sat there in silence, his confidence gone, replaced by the uneasy realization that for the first time in years, someone had finally seen through him. The days that followed felt like punishment wrapped in patience. The new chief didn't suspend Grant, didn't lecture him in front of others, didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he reassigned him, not to desk duty or some quiet corner, but to the heart of the city he'd spent his career avoiding. Community programs, youth outreach, neighborhood patrols, places where people didn't fear the badge but distrusted it deeply. Grant didn't understand the strategy. It felt beneath him, like being stripped of authority. But the chief's orders were clear. "You'll be working directly with the community this month." That was it. No explanation. No second chances promised, just expectation. The first day, Grant walked into a community center filled with laughter and noise. Children ran across the gym playing basketball, while volunteers organized supplies in the corner. The moment he entered the room, quieted, eyes turned. Some widened with discomfort, others narrowed with suspicion. Grant felt that silence pierced through his uniform. A woman at the front desk, middle-aged, kind of cautious, handed him a clipboard without meeting his eyes. "You can start by helping with the after-school safety class," she said. He nodded, unsure of what to do with his hands. Over the next few weeks, Grant spent hours among people who didn't trust him. He could feel it in every glance, every cautious smile. He wasn't Officer Grant, the man with authority. He was just a cop, a reminder of pain they'd carried for years. But as days passed, something in that environment began to crack through his armor. He watched the way kids looked up when the chief visited, not out of fear but respect. He saw the chief sit with them, laugh with them, ask about their lives, their dreams, their safety. The same man Grant had humiliated was now healing a community he'd once dismissed as trouble. Grant started listening more than he spoke. He learned names, heard stories. One afternoon, a young boy around 12 sat beside him during a break. His shoes were torn, his eyes bright. "You think I could be a cop someday?" the boy asked. The question hit him like a punch. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "Yeah," he finally said. "Yeah, you could." The boy smiled and nodded proudly before running back to the court. That small exchange stayed with Grant long after he left the center. Every evening, he'd catch himself replaying moments from his past, the faces he'd disrespected, the people he'd dismissed, the way he'd used power like a weapon instead of a shield. The chief never mentioned the café again, never brought it up in front of others, but his leadership lingered in everything he did. Each assignment, each interaction, felt like a mirror forcing Grant to see himself clearly for the first time. Something in him needed to. He would stand in the back, arms crossed, listening to residents talk about fear, injustice, and the hope that maybe this time the department would be different. Their words hit deeper than any reprimand ever could. One afternoon, during a city press briefing, the chief stood before reporters, officers, and citizens. Cameras flashed, microphones waited. Grant stood near the back wall. Uniform crisp, face solemn. The chief began speaking about reform, about responsibility, about rebuilding trust. "We can't erase what's been done," he said, "but we can decide who we become from this day forward." His words carried the weight of someone who had lived both sides of the struggle, the victim and the leader. He paused for a moment and looked directly toward Grant. "Even those who cause pain," he continued, "can become part of the healing if they choose to learn." The words weren't accusatory, they were redemptive. But for Grant, they landed like a confession he hadn't yet spoken aloud. After the briefing, the crowd began to disperse, the air thick with reflection. Grant lingered near the steps, staring at the ground, the noise fading around him. He knew what he had to do, though it wasn't easy. When the chief exited the hall, Grant approached him slowly. There was no swagger in his walk, no pride in his stance. He stopped a few feet away and spoke quietly. "Sir," he began, his voice unsteady. "About that day at the café," the chief looked at him, not with anger, but with patience. Grant took a breath, his throat tight. "I was wrong, completely wrong. Not just about you, but about everything I thought I knew about respect." For a moment, the two men stood there in silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. Grant felt the sting of shame, but also the faint flicker of something new. Humility. The chief nodded once, his expression soft but firm. "Then do better," he said simply. "That's all any of us can do." Grant nodded back, the weight in his chest shifting. The following week, Grant volunteered for a mentorship program with young recruits. He started showing up early, staying late, guiding others with a tone that was quieter, humbler. Some noticed the change, others didn't, but for the first time in his career, he didn't care about being noticed. He cared about being different. Life has a way of humbling the proud and lifting the silent. The moment Officer Grant spat on that man, he believed he'd proven his power. But what he really revealed was his weakness, his inability to see beyond skin. And when that same man walked into his life as his superior, fate wasn't being cruel. It was being just. Racism thrives where humility dies. It grows in the hearts of those who think respect is earned by fear instead of humanity. But the most powerful lesson in this story isn't revenge, it's grace. The new chief could have destroyed Grant's career, and no one would have blamed him. But he chose to educate, not retaliate, because real strength isn't in punishment, it's in transformation. The question is, when faced with your own moment of power, will you choose pride or change? Because one act of hate can define a man's fall, but one act of grace, that can define his redemption.